We are all 0 years old when we are born, aren't we? So theoretically, how can a baby be born at the age of 31? Let's examine this together. Before we start the video, I would be very grateful if you could subscribe and turn on notifications in return for my efforts. Let's begin. As you all know, an embryo is the initial stage of development of a living organism formed by the union of an egg cell and a sperm cell. Scientists began conducting research on embryos, and embryo transfer was first performed on humans in the 1980s. Prior to these studies, the technique had been tested on animals and proven successful before being applied to humans. In the first trials, embryos were created using egg and sperm cells obtained from volunteer couples undergoing IVF treatment. In other words, these couples were already couples who wanted to have their own children but were unable to conceive naturally. The world's first birth from a frozen embryo took place in Australia in 1984. The pregnancy began with the thawing of the embryo and its successful transfer to the uterus. The birth took place in 1984. This birth proved that the embryo freezing process, which had previously been considered experimental, could result in a real and healthy birth. Since then, this method has spread rapidly worldwide. So how did a donated and frozen embryo change the lives of a couple 30 years later? The story begins in the early 1990s. Linda Arkard had been trying to get pregnant for 6 years without success. Together with her husband, they decided to try IVF, which was a relatively new technology at the time. Arkard says, "People weren't familiar with it. Many people asked me, 'What are you doing?'" Linda Arkard resorted to this method and succeeded in creating 4 embryos in 1994. One of these was transferred to Linda Arkard's uterus, and a baby girl was born. Linda Arkard says, "I was very lucky to have a baby." The remaining 3 embryos were cryopreserved and stored in a storage tank. Arkard wanted to have more children, but her husband did not share the same opinion. She later divorced her husband and paid an annual fee of $1,000 to keep the embryos at the storage center. Things changed when she entered menopause, she says. She weighed her options. She didn't want to discard the embryos or donate them for research. She also didn't want to donate them anonymously to another family. She wanted to meet the parents and the babies to be born. Then she learned about embryo adoption. This is a type of embryo donation where both donors and recipients have a say in who the embryos go to or who adopts them. This process is typically overseen by explicitly religious institutions that believe embryos are morally equivalent to a born human being. Arkard was Christian. There are many organizations in the US that offer these adoption services, but not all of them accept embryos that have been stored for a long time. One reason for this is that these embryos were frozen and stored using unusual, outdated methods, and another reason is that older embryos are less likely to successfully develop into a baby after being thawed and transferred. "So many places wouldn't even take my information," says Arkard. Then she came across the Snowflakes program run by the Nightlight Christian Adoptions Agency. The agency was willing to accept her embryos, but it needed Arkard's medical records from the time the embryos had been created, as well as the embryos' lab records. "Our matching process is really driven by the preferences of the placing family," says Beth Button, executive director of the Snowflakes program. Arkard's preference was for a married Caucasian, Christian couple living in the US. "I didn't want them to go out of the country," says Arkard. "And being Christian is very important to me, because I am." According to the information we have, Arkard was very devoted to his religion and embraced it wholeheartedly. He wanted those who would carry on his legacy to be the same way. It was at this point that Lindsay and Tim Pierce, a couple who had been trying to have children for 7 years but had been unable to do so, came forward. 30 years later, the embryos that Arkard wanted to keep would be the source of a couple's happiest moments. Unfortunately, one of the remaining 3 embryos stopped growing. 2 were transferred to Lindsay's uterus, and 1 developed into a fetus. This was wonderful news for Lindsay and Tim Pierce. Lindsay and Tim Pierce's baby was born on July 27, 2025. They named their baby Daniel. This baby is theoretically the oldest baby in the world and holds a record. We at Myrex Speaks would like to congratulate them. We would like to thank our viewers for watching. If you want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe and like us. And if you've watched this far, I'll give you a cookie. See you in the next videos.